Violence is everywhere. It is in the movies that we watch, the games that we play, and the advertisements that we see every day. It is on the news, in faraway countries, and right here in the United States. It is one of the most universal aspects of modern culture, and one of the most misunderstood. Right now, the overwhelming majority of images being created and circulated in the United States, and indeed the world, exist to serve a material agenda in some capacity. Violence is another one of those universal aspects of human behavior that advertisements are tailored to appeal to. We've all heard the saying, sex sells. This is true for violence too. Violence sells. 17 of the 20 highest-grossing films released from 2000 to 2010 contained an on-screen character death. Consider the media that is popular today, too. The Avengers, Call of Duty, Game of Thrones, every Tarantino film, Fast and Furious, The Walking Dead, Black Panther, The Dark Knight, Star Wars, and on and on. It's nothing new. The first drawings ever created by humans contained depictions of hunts, and the earliest known depictions of humans in battle have been dated to at least 10,000 years ago. Violence sells because it has power. In 1985, Italian director Ruggero Deodato shot what is perhaps among the most controversial films made to date, the aptly named Cannibal Holocaust. The half-docufiction, half-found-footage horror film contains the on-screen deaths of 6 real animals. In fact, the film was so graphic that charges of murder were brought up against Deodato, and only dropped when he verified that the actors in the film were still alive. This is one of the films that characterized an era of Italian film in the 70s and 80s, which consisted of a sordid mix of mondo documentaries, little more than sensationalized montages compiled to shock Western audiences, and a slew of B-movies and knockoffs that featured extreme violence. There was a reason why so many of these films were made, because they were wildly successful. Cannibal Holocaust grossed $2 million in the initial US theatrical run alone, and only cost $100,000 to produce. Its gratuitous violence was front and center in its marketing. Sensationalism is nothing new. Violence sells whether it is real or not, and this is evidence in news media as well. Despite the world being more peaceful than at any other time in human history, we see more news about war and death than ever before. But this is all secondary to the real question. We know how violent images are used, but why are they so effective? Why is something which is thought of as reprehensible constitute a vast portion of what we choose to view? Images of graphic violence are capable of eliciting uniquely powerful emotional responses, ranging from disgust to satisfaction. Exactly what kind of response is hugely dependent upon the context of the viewing, but it almost always produces some kind of reaction. This, I think, is because of its intimate ties to the human experience. Violence and the imagery of it carries with it the implications of harm, pain, and death, forces as old as living beings themselves. The physiological effects of violent images could be likened to that of the smell of food or the prospect of sex, deeply tied to our physicality, our nature as creatures of flesh, and therefore profoundly influential to our experience as human beings. But while food and sex are both attractants, disgust is a repellent. Violence is unique, and that it can be both of these things.
We recognize something when we see these photographs. We're very attracted to it, and of course we're repelled by it, and we don't understand, these feelings we're having about it. There's some connection that everybody feels to these photographs. And I think even a kid knows that, because it's obscene. It's a terrible intrusion. It's the ultimate blood sport, and it would be not useful to pretend to anyone that it isn't exciting, that it doesn't really turn people on. Always has done, and it always will. It can't be an accident that the bloodiest century in history was also the century of, the movie camera. I've heard for years and years and years that sort of pathetic claim of television journalists that because they were there all the time, and it was on the news every night, that they were responsible for shortening the war in Vietnam, when my feeling is that they actually were instrumental in prolonging it.
That first moment, your first kill, it's strange because it's something you've never done before. But after that, well, with me, it started getting good. The killing started getting good. So, something is wrong here. Something is wrong with this picture.
What was good about it?
It was such a rush. It was like a rush better than any dope thing I got on the street. Something different. It was just a high you couldn't even imagine. So you keep on killing.
Every kill you made seemed like it made you feel a little better. In other words, there was a place that it sort of cheered you up to a certain extent. I mean, you didn't jump up and down or, you know, with joy and all this, but it was a place in your heart that it just made you feel good.
Could you compare it to anything?
Sex. And that sounds bad. That sounds bad because, you know, can I say this on camera? Sex is such an enjoyable thing. You take it and you compare it to killing somebody and having the same feeling. And that's where you's at.
And that's why you do it every time.
Yeah.
People don't talk about this kind of thing very often, and that is perhaps a reason why it is so appealing. It's a kind of taboo, with a degree of guilt usually attached to it. We don't like to admit that we find these things so captivating, so fascinating, that we cannot help but reproduce them endlessly in books and movies and TV and video games. There is an immeasurable difference between real-life violence and the violence that we see depicted in entertainment media every day. This is a key component in all depictions of violence, whether or not the audience believes that it is really happening. All the same, real or artificial, images of violence never fail to thrill us. How portrayals of violence are constructed varies a great deal, depending on what purpose it is being used for. In the modern world, this is usually marketing, and to this end, the vast majority of media violence is stylized to varying degrees depending on its artistic purpose. For example, Star Wars is a whimsical space opera, a sometimes goofy story presented like a heroic epic. Its violence, thus, exists as a component of the story, but not the main narrative focus. Star Wars isn't about violence, but it uses violence as a way to tell its story, by taking advantage of the unique and varied ways in which violence can be used as a narrative tool. Characters can die, see death, navigate danger, be dismembered, and kill other characters. Intense expressions of narrative interaction, but easily expressing exactly the kind of heightened dramatic storytelling that characterizes a heroic epic. Violence works this way because compelling narratives are about conflict, and physical violence is conflict taken to its natural extreme. It is especially useful when making this conflict into a visual spectacle. Indeed, the violence used in Star Wars is not only integral to the narrative, but perhaps more importantly, it is spectacular. A functionally identical narrative could be created with no violence at all, but a movie or television show or game is more than simply its narrative. Violence can add drama, flavor, and spectacle in ways that simply cannot be replicated otherwise, and thus contribute to a work's unique artistic impression and identity. The iconic aesthetics of Star Wars are a defining part of the series, and part of why it's so appealing. The bloodless, sterilized violence presented in Star Wars also serves a very practical purpose, which was to make the film palatable to a wider audience and make it capable of garnering much more popularity as a family film. Toy sales were a huge factor in the success of Star Wars, and in defining its identity in relation to consumers. But this can be taken to the other extreme. violence that is emphasized, not for shock value, but for its own darkly humorous sake. In this case, the work takes full advantage of the fact that the audience is aware that they're viewing a fiction, that what they're seeing is not real, and so the violence can be viewed in a very different light. The expectation of entertainment, especially when violence is a part of that expectation, can make even the most gruesome acts of violence entertaining and even humorous rather than disturbing. We permit ourselves to enjoy the spectacle of violence fully, because the spectacle is removed from the true implications, real suffering and death, and with them, the discomfort with the idea of viewing these images. Even when the violence is not depicted as either a sterile component of the narrative, or as a parody of itself, the experience is still very different from viewing real violence. Consider the multi-tiered spectacle of Rambo. As much focus is placed on the character himself as the over-the-top stylized violence that he's participating in. The emphasis on his character as the perpetrator of violence creates the association with that character's traits and the violence that he is performing. The focus on the character, then, amounts to a focus on the identity of the violent actor. In Rambo, violence is an indisputable expression of his will. Rambo and the violence that he participates in are presented as incredibly powerful. He is capable of facing down entire militias on his own. They are utterly at his mercy. Through violence, he has conquered them, and the gratification that this provides, intimately tied as it is to his physicality and gender expression, is presented as an extension of his masculine identity. The ties between violence and the masculine ideal are as numerous as they are complicated. Physiologically, testosterone is associated with increased levels of impulsivity and aggression, although endocrinology is a relatively new and poorly understood field, and neurochemistry is hardly the only factor at play. Much more easily observable, but scarcely more definitive, is the role of cultural and social factors in the associations between masculinity and violence, especially because the social concept of masculine behavior is an entirely separate entity from the biologically masculinizing effects of testosterone. Violence is thought of as a natural, expected component of masculinity. The invisibility of the trend of men committing the overwhelming majority of violence implies that it is expected and even normalized.
What the media do is help to construct violent masculinity as a cultural norm. In other words, violence isn't so much a deviation as it is an accepted part of masculinity. We have to start examining this system and offering alternatives, because one of the major consequences of all of this is that there's been a growing connection made in our society between being a man and being violent. In fact, some of the most serious problems in contemporary American society, especially those connected with violence, can be looked at as essentially problems in contemporary American masculinity.
9 à la banque.
I need another 1,000.
I admire your courage, Miss...
Trench. Sylvia Trench. I admire your luck, Mr.
Bond. James Bond.
The Bond films are a fantastic case study for the changing interplay between the Western masculine ideal and its relationship to stylized media violence. Sean Connery's Bond is very different from Daniel Craig's Bond, but both are masculine fantasies. Where Connery's Bond is unemotional, promiscuous, chauvinistic, and defined by his career, Craig's Bond is more personal, emotional, distinct from his profession, and open to relationships rather than merely sexual conquest, although his sexuality and promiscuity are still very prevalent. As for similarities, both are violent, Connery more heroically and professionally so, while Craig is portrayed as more brutish and visceral. Both are also notorious womanizers. But while Bond's masculinity has changed in its relationship with women, emotion, and his career, it has not abandoned violence. In fact, the violence has seemed almost to intensify, although this is likely as much a result of changing filmic conventions toward realism as it is of changing ideas about masculinity. The content of Craig's Bond films are slightly more realistic in that they are more technically feasible than what is depicted in earlier films, but they are no less fantastic in their simplistic portrayal of the world and Bond himself. The association with masculinity and violence goes far beyond the screen, however.
For example, over 85% of the people who commit murder are men, and the women that do often do so as a defense against men who are battering them. 90% of people who commit violent physical assault are men. 95% of serious domestic violence is perpetrated by males, and it's been estimated that 1 in 4 men will use violence against a partner in their lifetime. Over 95% of dating violence is committed by men, and very often it's young men in their teens. Studies have found that men are responsible for between 85 and 95% of child sexual abuse, whether the victim is female or male. And 99.8% of people in prison convicted of rape are men. What this shows is that an awful lot of boys and men are inflicting an incredible level of pain and suffering, both on themselves and on others. And we know that much of the violence is cyclical, that many boys who are abused as children grow up and become perpetrators themselves. So calling attention to the way that masculinity is connected to these problems is not anti-male. It's just being honest about what's going on in boys' and men's lives.
This almost seems to be reflected in media. Almost all action films star a male lead and feature men perpetrating violence, or else they're heavily subject to the male gaze in their depiction of women perpetrating violence. Much of the remainder show women perpetrating violence either by a masculinized woman or motivated by aspects of maternity or femininity. This is principally a result of femininity having been historically defined in relation to masculinity and not as independent of it. Thus, violence, a masculine behavior, is thought of as incompatible with classically defined femininity unless carried out specifically in performance of femininity.
When girls commit violence, that's always the subject. The gendered nature of the crime is always part of the discussion.
A sensational case goes to trial in Virginia tomorrow involving a man who was sexually mutilated by his wife.
Now, Lorena Bobbitt, her crime was brutal, admittedly, and I understand, believe me, as a man, understand why people would be, especially men, would be very uncomfortable about that. But every day, men are murdering and mutilating women, and it doesn't cause as great a national outcry. What's happened is because violence has been gendered masculine, we think it's unusual only when women do it. When men do it, it's so normal that its masculine character is unremarkable.
This trend has become slightly less pronounced in recent years, but is still nonetheless very present in modern media. Violence, culturally tied as it is to masculinity, continues to be encouraged by popular performances of masculinity in all aspects of life, by parents, role models, professions, and entertainment. This encouragement stems from the widespread romanticization of violence. The romanticization of violence is a direct result of both its stylization and the role that it plays in presenting narratives, especially visually, but also as a result of political forces. Propaganda often makes use of stylized violence in its relationship to the masculine ideal to convey narratives or reinforce beliefs about the world. Of course, there are the classic examples of early to mid-20th century propaganda posters, but recent incarnations often do this in far more complex ways. No matter how gruesome or distasteful the violence is presented as, it is almost always presented as worth it, and as a necessary sacrifice, what had to be done. This is a personal appeal to the masculine identity. Consider the close identification with one's profession that typifies traditional masculinity. In modern propaganda, the shift from blatantly jingoistic and chivalrous narratives about violence to stoic, gritty depictions, which are no less jingoistic in their own right, are the result of a shift in perspective concerning wartime violence over the past 20th century. Instead of portraying clearly fictional, glorified visuals, this new narrative takes advantage of the brutality of realism, of the illusion of photographic truth to underscore its message. They appeal to traditional masculinity and the masculine identity to glorify and justify violence, especially when it is carried out on behalf of the state or institution. By compartmentalizing violence in this way, it can be much more easily rationalized. Violence existing solely within the arenas of warfare, criminal justice, or ideological struggle is implicitly thought of as okay or normal because it is expected. It is invisible in almost the same way as the tie between masculinity and violence. Not to be tacky, but I cannot help but think that the Joker's sentiment about the normalization of violence rings true on some level.
If tomorrow I tell the press that, like, a gangbanger will get shot, or a truckload of soldiers will be blowing up, nobody panics, because it's all part of the plan. But when I say that one little old mare will die, well, then everyone loses their minds.
No conversation about violent imagery in the modern era is complete without addressing the elephant in the room: video games. Does this perpetuation of violent images, especially as part of an interactive medium where the participant is not just viewing the violence but acting it out, have an effect on us? Of course it does. All images do. But I would argue that the effects of violent video games in terms of cultivating violent tendencies are no different than movies or TV. Video games are simply the latest in a long line of scapegoats cited as the cause for a societal ill, which is much more rooted in conceptions of traditional masculinity. The consequent images that popularize this notion of traditional masculinity, of violence, control, and physicality, can be found in any medium. But nevertheless, the depictions of violence in video games are fascinating, because of the interactive nature of the medium and its relative newness as a form of experiential art. The violence on display here is not so dissimilar as the violence depicted in other mediums, and indeed serves the same purpose, but they're more effective in this purpose because of the interactivity. Films and movies depicting masculine fantasies force the viewer to experience this fantasy vicariously by observing the characters, but the video game brings them one step closer to feeling as though they are realized. It does this by taking advantage of the artificial nature of video games. Just as on a movie screen, everything that happens in a video game is without real consequence. The digital presence of other people in multiplayer games, and the consequence-free nature of the visual environment both mean that competition can take very unique forms. They allow the players to experience the feeling of dominance and control by combining violent visuals with the knowledge that their competitor is human. Victories against another player or group of players are almost always more satisfying than victories against the game's AI, partly because human opponents represent a competition of skill rather than a display. These promote a sense of dominance and artificial superiority in the form of score or kills, which can be leveraged as a way to fulfill the need for control that is so central to maintaining the traditional masculine identity. The same sense of competition and desire for dominance is part of the reason why sports are so popular among men. But video games substitute the physicality of a sport with the practically limitless capacity for spectacles of violence. Only in video games is it acceptable to rip your opponent's spine out. This kind of ultra-violence occupies the same realm as it does in Deadpool or Kill Bill. It is gratuitous to the point of absurdity, perhaps evoking a gross-out response, but nowhere near as gut-wrenching as actual violence. The audience is distanced from the violence, first by its own absurdity, and second by the constant signifiers that it is a game. The HUD, polygons, lighting, predictable animations, no-clipping, particle effects, and any number of tells which signify a virtual and thus consequence-free environment. In this sense, games have the capacity to be the ultimate power fantasy, as of yet. To an extent, the overwhelming majority of video games are power fantasies. Practically all games feature actions which would be impossible to achieve realistically. But a power fantasy in this sense is merely an extension of the male fantasy of the masculine ideal, one which allows the consumer to become a part of the fantasy and act it out, instead of just observing. Why would you watch Rambo mowing down hordes of spineless cops when you can be an indestructible, rage-fueled super soldier curb-stomping demons on Mars? Or, on the other hand, you could play Red Orchestra 2. And its successor, Rising Storm 2 Vietnam, When I first played this, it was kind of a scary experience, and it stood out to me because fear is typically not the response one expects when playing a first-person shooter. It wasn't a grand narrative or complex characters, art in the traditional sense, that elicited such an emotional reaction. It was an experience. The player is instilled with a sense of powerlessness. This game is more about staying alive than it is about fighting the other team. Most other FPSs, like Doom and Call of Duty, use the on-screen visual violence as a vehicle for expressing a power fantasy. Red Orchestra takes this in the opposite direction, by having the player participate in a chaotic and highly lethal battle, and by using the constant violence as a way to create a thrillingly harrowing experience. This can go even further, however. The recent advancements in VR technology have brought us closer to our visual worlds than ever before. Resident Evil 7 is cited as one of the most terrifying VR horror games made to date, and VR technology is still very much in its infancy.
I don't know, I'm hearing sounds. Oh, something's coming! Oh no! Oh God! Stop! Oh fuck! Stop! No! Get off of me! Get off of me! I don't like it! I don't like it! She has a knife! She has a knife! I don't like it! I don't like it! Oh, baby! Get off of me! Get off of me!
As we further narrow the gap between the consumer and the violence that they are observing and taking part in, the effects of these experiences on the participant will become more pronounced. What kind of new experiences will be made that take advantage of this closeness? Whatever they are, I believe that violence will be a part of many of them. Violence and images of it are so deeply ingrained in our society, culture, and psyche that I do not foresee any abatement in the volume of violent images being produced. What is important, however, is to examine what function these displays are serving and why they are being created. Violence perpetrated by men in the real world is the cause of unfathomable suffering, especially upon the victims and survivors of it, but also upon its perpetrators. The human fascination with physical violence does in some ways transcend the notion of masculinity or culture. Because of the nature of our physical forms, and because of our irreconcilable existential relationship with death, it would naturally follow that a fixation upon manipulations of the form which we inhabit would arise, owing to our body's nature as both extensions of and the sole anchors of our existence. Destruction of these forms, too, would naturally be among those things which we are fixated upon. Because it brings about death, violence has a relationship with our existence that nothing else can truly emulate. It is because of this, I think, that depictions of violence are and will continue to be created by humans for as long as we exist.